I was told that I should set aside some time for questions. You might have some questions. My book has been out for about half a year now, but I'm not retiring on the royalties yet. And I have no offers of a movie contract. So, yes.
Could I make a couple of comments? We were in Tofino just recently, and I'm absolutely positive that I saw a sign that said nuclear free zone, and I couldn't understand it.
In Tofino, yeah.
Yes, Tofino, I couldn't understand that. Another observation is during the blockade with the Russians in Cuba.
In 1962?
Yes.
Yes.
I was on the Emergency Measures Organization.
Yes.
And at that time, they told us, that group of people, that there were already planes going to Russia to drop nuclear bombs, and that they would not come back unless they were told to come back. They were to continue on unless they were...
The American Strategic Air Command was told.
Yeah.
Okay, what we know, what we do know, at least on the basis of the documents that I've seen, is that one of the things that happened at the height of the crisis when Kennedy was deciding what he's going to do next, because the whole American military machine is so complex, he doesn't know what they're doing at every minute of the day. The thing is massive. What we now know is that there were a series of U-2 flights coming over Siberia, and the Russians at that time could have reacted because these U-2 flights could be seen as they're paving the way for a B-52 bomber attack, that they're on reconnaissance. And the Russians could have very easily, right at the height of the crisis, could have very easily interpreted that as an incoming B-52 bomber possibility. And they kept their cool. And I think it's a credit to them because the Russians were in a position in 1962 to strike first. Why do you think that is? If a crisis happens vis-a-vis the United States, they should strike first. Why? Right, that their nuclear arsenal was much less than the United States. So the only way that you can have an effective nuclear arsenal is use it first. Because if the United States strikes you, they'll wipe out your nuclear arsenal. So the only logical thing for Russians to do in a crisis situation is to strike first, and they didn't. What we also know, again, just in the last decade or so, new documents come forward, we now know that, the Russian ships that were coming down the Atlantic, and then they stopped when they encountered the American blockade. Well, underneath those ships were Russian submarines, and they were equipped with atomic torpedoes. And you may recall that at one point, the Americans started depth charging, and they could have very easily... Here's the problem. You're a Russian, and you're in this submarine for about 2 months, and you're out of communication with Moscow, and you're given the orders that you decide in time of crisis whether or not you're going to launch these atomic torpedoes. Can you imagine living with 100 other Russians on this little thing? You're not sleeping properly, and your faculties are not completely intact. And yet the captain decided to surface. But had he decided to launch the torpedoes, it would have been absolutely disastrous. But as far as your point about, we don't, that the U-2 flights were going, I don't know of any B-52s themselves that actually went into Soviet airspace, but...
No, they weren't. They were on their way.
Yeah. Yes, they were flying to what was called the fail-safe points. Yeah. They would fly, these fail-safe points would be, let's say, about 1,000 miles outside the Soviet Union, and they would circle there, and they would either be given orders to attack or they go back home. Yeah. Yes, you're absolutely right. The B-52s were at their fail-safe points in 1962. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Can I back up a bit historically? Because I said we were able to evolve, and you supported that, so evolution of our country. But that goes back, I think to the Lord Durham report.
What do you say? We're two cultures warring within the bosom of a single state. Remember that? Or two nations warring within the bosom of a single state.
But the reason that Durham was sent, that Lord Durham came here, was because Britain was so appalled that they lost the colonies. And so when they started to rattle the chains in Canada, they said, off you go and sort this out. And his report was just that. Don't fight, because you lose them too.
Yeah.
Give them some space and let them sort it out.
And you may recall, you can go back even to the Constitution Act of 1791, where we had to make accommodations with Quebec to keep them from moving closer to the United States, or even in 1775 to keep them from fighting with the Americans. We maintain a certain accommodation. Yeah.
And I think then you get a totally different sense of who you are if you're born and raised in this country than if you're born and raised in the United States. For instance, none of us, when we went to school here, stood up in the morning and put our hands over our hearts and pledged allegiance to the flag of Canada.
No, we did have the Queen. In my classroom, we had the Queen, and we did sing God Save the Queen.
Not quite the same.
Not quite the same?
Loyal and true to this empire and to everything for which it stands.
Did you? Yes. You went to a less progressive school than I
You're too young.
Protestant school board, biggest school board in the country.
not in Vancouver.
Not in Vancouver,
No, but we are, I mean, there are some very significant, although maybe not surface, not that clean on the surface, differences between the two.
Thank you. Yes.
I wondered if you thought there was much difference in America. They were sending people off the Vietnam War and the draft. In Canada, we had LIP grants, OFY. The government was actually paying people to provide social services for people.
I think you're absolutely, that fits in. You remember I said when Harry Rankin and others are on council and we provide money to various LSD drug houses here? The same thing, that fits into that larger context, that LIP grants and so on. We're much more sort of tolerant of this emerging counterculture, and we'll provide financial assistance for it. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And the Americans, as far as I know, didn't do, the federal government didn't do anything comparable to that. No, no. Yes?
Really interesting from the Canadian perspective. I think it's important not to underestimate the influence of McCarthyism and the anti-communism movement that you talked about, because it really put a lid on enhanced conformity and conservatism. It put a lid on what, eventually happened, when there was liberal thinking and nonconformity. And like Harry Rankin never could have become
Such a vocal, outspoken critic, yeah.
When you really look at the influences, they were really wiped out.
Well, on that, related to that, on my own research, I did for a while work on anti-communism in Canada in the 1950s, and I did get into some RCMP reports about the problem of communists in the National Film Board and the CBC after World War II, because during the war, everybody was on the left and worked in the National Film Board and the CBC. And so there was a concern as the Cold War sets in, there's going to be communists in these organizations. And so there's a massive RCMP investigation. And they found, I think, 3 communists in the National Film Board and maybe 3 or 4 in the CBC out of hundreds of people working in these organizations. And I can remember reading the RCMP report. He said, well, look, these people are a bit of a problem, but they're young people with families. Let's transfer them to the post office. That's the Canadian way. Yeah. So, but you're right. I mean, we don't have anything comparable to the McCarthy. In fact, a lot of the academics that were persecuted by McCarthy ended up coming. In fact, the person who, I think his name is William Holland. Does anybody remember William Holland at UBC? He organized the Department of Asian Studies and turned it into one of the best Asian studies programs in North America. He was a casualty of the McCarthy era. Came to UBC. And there were several dozens of people like Professor Holland that came here. Yeah.
Why was the Port Huron statement named Port Huron?
Oh, yeah, in the summer of '62, dozens of these progressive students met to create a charter of what we stand for. And they needed a place that was cheap. And Port Huron, I think it's on Lake Michigan. And it was something controlled. It was a recreational center for the AFL-CIO. So the union gave them free rent for a week. And so they descended on this place, and Tom Hayden and others came up with this marvelous document to guide us to the promised land, if you want. Yeah.
In your research, have you got any sense of what proportion of American deserters and dodgers who came to Canada stayed?
I can't give you the exact percentage, but all the ones I certainly knew stayed and became well-placed in Canadian society. Even though Jimmy Carter, President Carter, gave amnesty, I think, later, many of them continued to stay. And I think there's still a large number in Nelson today.
I went to college in Toronto in the early 70s, and some of my classes, but a quarter to a third would have been Dodgers, and a fair number of deserters as well. And they had a much more serious time. And over when the amnesty came out, they were sort of allowed to come back and basically get dishonorable discharges. But those people for whom prison was no longer a threat to go back home actually stayed, at least in places that I knew of in Toronto.
Yeah, no, these Americans were, they were highly educated for the most part, and all of them those who stayed did very well. And I think that's why they stayed, because Canada did offer them prosperity to a point. Yes?
On the JFK assassination in the 60s.
There still is, the question was about the JFK assassination in November 1963. Of course, everybody asks, myself included, what were you doing when I was at Burnaby Central, grade 10, and the principal came on the PA system and said, the president has been assassinated, you have the rest of the day off. Now, this assassination, Americans love to develop conspiracy theories, and it starts, I think, with Lincoln. Right from Lincoln on, anything that's gone wrong, there's been a conspiracy. And there are many Americans today that don't accept Kennedy's death as just a lone assassin. And there have been massive investigations. As far as, I can only speak for the historical community, historians who work in the documents, and like if there's a CIA conspiracy, we haven't found any documents to support a conspiracy, okay, in the American archives at least. Because you probably saw that dreadful Oliver Stone movie, JFK, and he suggests that Lyndon Johnson and the CIA are behind it. I mean, that's really on the far side of the moon, that
Could that be disinformation?
The movie.
Things like that, yes.
All I can say is the more you work in the documents, it's really hard to have a conspiracy in the United States for several reasons. First of all, if anything happens, Americans like to talk. If you're part of a conspiracy, you'll get paid $1 million to write a book about it. So you're always encouraged. The second thing is I've lived in Washington, D.C. for 4 to 5 years myself, and I just worked on something mundane like Canadian-American relations, and I talked to all the key decision makers in the 50s. They love to talk. Another point I'd make is the Freedom of Information Act, it makes research much more easier in the United States than in Canada. It's much more difficult to get into top secret documents in Ottawa. So the point is, if you live in a place, you know how to interview people, you know how to uncover things. There hasn't been anything uncovered in CIA or FBI collections.
What about the freedom of the press?
What about it?
Years ago, a book called Farewell America.
Yeah.
And it had been printed in Belgium, and it could not be printed in the British or English-speaking world. And I thought, well, let's try and investigate that. And I phoned up printers and publishers in Canada, the United States, and England, and they would not touch them. There was no reason given.
I can't give you any. All I can say is, as an academic, I get paid. I have an oil well in Alberta. And they pay me to criticize, okay? And they get upset when I might support, let's say, a certain initiative in Afghanistan or something. They want me to, I get paid, for 40 years I've been paid to criticize. That's what we do. And they encourage us. I get promoted to full professor by criticizing. That's how the academic system works. And I think the same thing with the media. If you uncover something in the media, like, the Watergate story, Woodward and Bernstein. I mean, there's thousands of Woodwards and Bernsteins out there just leaping at the opportunity to expose somebody. So, but I can't address that book that you made reference to. Yeah.
Do you see the present protest that's going on at present in New York and in Toronto and here? Is this the beginning of another sort of culture uprising?
Let me,
Against the
Good.
excessiveness of the upper elite.
Good. In my time, when I'm talking about the 60s, I see everything in the shadow of the United States. That all these things that happened in Vancouver were played out first in San Francisco and other cities. These protests started, as I recall, didn't they start in New York City? And it's basically, it's a worldwide phenomenon. And why I think it's now a worldwide phenomenon is the internet. But nonetheless, I'm still making the point that for better or worse, sort of interesting new political developments or cultural developments, they're still happening first in the United States, and then the internet takes them and magnifies it all around the world, and then people get involved. Now, does this mean that there's a new cultural movement? No, there's nothing cultural about this movement. I mean, in the 60s, I think at the end of the day, I think why the 60s are so fascinating, because I think it's the last time in history where we've had a genuine revolt against consumer culture, and that we wanted to live on peace, love, and rock and roll, and not acquire material things and so on. These protesters today, I think they want jobs, don't they? The sign I saw was, I want a good middle-class job. I think that's the issue. You remember Timothy Leary, tune in, turn on, and drop out. I don't see that with this. I don't see a new culture being born here. I just simply see it as a middle-class movement. They are not going to get the jobs that the baby boomers had. I mean, that's how my sense of all these protests today is the baby boomers, myself included, we did end up getting reasonably good jobs, professional jobs. We've run up, in the name of social justice in Canada, a $650 billion debt, and including Medicare costs and so on. And the younger generation is going to have to pay this off, and there's going to be rising unemployment, there's going to be higher taxes, and I think they have a sense of, ingratitude towards the older generation. I think there's an element of that brewing. I think what you might see is some kind of generational hostility, not a class hostility or a cultural conflict, but I think there's a sense that we baby boomers, myself included, got the good jobs, and they're not going to get the good jobs, and there's a sense of anxiety about that. I don't know, somebody else got any comments on that point?
You don't see any parallels between the early peace movements and the early part of the 60s and 70s, what's going on today, the Occupy movement?
The early peace movement were basically academics and the BC Communist Party. It was a much narrower base of support. I think this is a little broader today, and I think the anxiety out there is greater than perhaps the early peace movement anxiety. They're young and they have a sense that they're not going to get the jobs that they go to university and they're $40,000 in debt, and they're not going to get the jobs that their parents and others told them they were going to get. Yeah.
I was just going to bring up the fact that taking a peaceful attitude during one summer, for sure, and possibly 1968, on the field down in Kitsilano, all the draft dodgers, the kids who run away from home, the hippies, you name it, twice a day they were fed.
Yes.
And I was part of the volunteer handing out food, and my son was with me one day, and he said, God, they eat as well or better than we do.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
The food was amazing, but these huge lineups. And it was all very peaceful, and everybody chatted to each other. It was a way of handling a crowd that could have become out of control that summer.
Exactly, like Chicago in the summer of '68. No, I think your point fits in with the larger theme I'm developing, is that authority in Canada, they may or may not like these cultural movements, but at the same time, they're going to make sure that they don't get out of control. They're going to be fed properly, be clothed properly, and the rule of law will prevail. There are examples to the contrary, I know, but how I do history is I don't have, here's how I get into debates with my colleagues who specialize in Canadian history. If you just do Canadian history by itself, you can find all sorts of social injustice. But I teach actually world history at the University of Alberta, and I always measure everything by the standards of world history. And whatever we do here, the sweeping generalization I always make is we're by far the most benign country in all of recorded history. I can't think of any other countries being... Look, what other country has, as the official opposition, a party that wants to tear the country apart? I mean, only in Canada. We are doing things in Canada that have never happened historically in any other country. It's a really,
What would be another example of such a thing?
of the Parti Québécois or the?
Yeah, aside from that, but you said we're doing things that no other country has done historically. What would be another example?
I think by and large, our welfare state is rather new. I think our whole approach to the Arctic is interesting. I think we've got some interesting environmental ideas going on here. Given the size of Canada, I think we're punching above our weight in terms of interesting new things. I'm not saying it's the center of the universe, but I'm just saying when you add up a lot of things, environmental things, or Medicare or whatever, it's quite, we're the only country that's next to Cuba, which I don't think works that well, but the Medicare system, it's completely nationalized here, and every other country, the European social democracy, all have a hybrid Medicare system. We're rather unique on that. And it seems to be, I think we take it for granted, but I got a friend from Duke University who's just retiring here. He can't even get it into his head that you can walk down the street and go to a clinic and get proper services. He's a professor at Duke, he can't get that in the United States. We've got things here that we don't recognize in the bigger sweep of history that are rather unique and in some ways quite remarkable. And I'm certainly not a Canadian nationalist. Yeah.
I just have two quick questions. One is, was there a hierarchy within the different groups of hippies? And two, I've connected to Twitter like 4 times a day, so I'm just wondering how the 60s protests organized.
Okay, the first question, was there a hierarchy? I really think there was. I think the hip capitalists got the best of all worlds in Kitsilano in the 1960s. They would be the guys that threw the parties. They would be the guys that were at the center, if you want, if there was a hierarchy. But again, you have to use that in a larger perspective. There's not a hierarchy like, let's say, the Toronto Dominion Bank has a hierarchy, right? It's less of a hierarchy. But yes, I think you're right. Even within the hippie community, there are some elements that are sort of in the limelight. And so your second question was?
I was a student in communication at SFU, so I'm always interested about communication and how people organize. So nowadays it's through Twitter or through Facebook.
Yes, good question. Yeah, I think this is why this Occupy Vancouver movement is a global movement. I think the internet has fundamentally altered things. And the communication at that time, and this is what I tried to work on, and it's harder in those days, the communication, everything was with California, San Francisco. The connection was, what we would do is, to communicate, in those days, we would hitchhike down to San Francisco for the summer. You may recall that. Or San Francisco acid rock bands would come up and play in Vancouver at various venues. Or we would watch on TV the concerts in Golden Gate Park, the free concerts in Golden Gate, and they were replicated here in Stanley Park. So that's the kind of communication that went on. But it was basically Vancouver and California. And the lines of communication were somewhat nebulous. Many of us also went down and lived there for a half a year or so, just moved to Haight-Ashbury. But it's a much more, outdated form of communication. Now it's instant with the internet. And I think what's kind of remarkable about modern technology and communications is it makes it much more difficult for the rise of totalitarian states. And it makes it easier for, I think, how you can read the whole Middle East protest movement and why things fell so quickly is everybody's on their cell phone communicating. And they have access to, and I think even Al Jazeera, a source that I don't read daily, but even that has had an enormous effect on new communication systems like that have changed the political landscape dramatically.
I'm just curious, say for instance, okay, there's a protest at 2 p.m. on Tuesday. How would word spread about that?
What, right now? I have no idea what goes on now, but in those days, how we took out, the Georgia Strait would always take out an ad. We would put posters up at UBC. And we would get professors to announce events in class. That's what we did. It's a very outdated system. Okay. All right, I think I've had enough. Thank you very much.